Baker, and I'm here with the great folks from Cheap Joe's Art Stuff in Boone, North Carolina, and I want to show you a little bit about how I mix my paints for pouring. I get a lot of emails and people asking me, how do you mix the paints? What is the proportion? What works? What paints you use? All these kinds of things because I do pouring. So I've just bought these little Glad containers or Rubbermaid or whatever from the store, and the nice thing about them is that they have a little lid, so whatever paint I don't use during that day, I can seal it up and I can take it with me home. So this has ended up to be a nice thing for me to pour with. I do not ever throw my paint away after I pour with it. The misconception that pouring takes a lot of paint isn't necessarily true. I find that I save all the paint and I make it all work for me. One of the nice things about pouring is that the colors can meld on the paper, and you actually, because you're pouring all the excess off, you might not use as much paint as you would if you were just direct painting. I'm using Cheap Joe's American Journey professional grade watercolors for my pouring. These are the only watercolors that I pour with for a couple of reasons. The color is nice and intense, and they really work well when you go to mix them up. Some paints, some different brands, every brand of paint has its own qualities, as we all know, and we all have our favorites. But one of the things I like about this is that it doesn't clump and it doesn't have as much granular. It seems to be a little more refined, doesn't have as much granular buildup on the bottom of my container, and I really like that. And the colors are nice and intense. They're permanent colors, so they give me a nice mix. I have tried pouring with other paints, and this is my favorite. When I stumbled onto this, I'm like, this is the one I really want to use. I don't endorse very many products, but I endorse them because I use them. Now I'm mixing up here a little bit of ultramarine blue, a little bit of indigo, a little bit of harvest wheat. A really good color to use is Joe's Yellow. If you have not poured in the past, I recommend the three primaries: Joe's Red, Joe's Yellow, and Joe's Blue. I'm not going to use those today because I tend to get sort of the same colors, so I thought I'd mix it up a little bit. And then I also use an indigo, and that's how you get your deep rich colors in the end, because if you've seen my work, I will pour sometimes 20 layers, and at the end the color is very deep and very rich. So for my red today, I'm going to use a little bit of Joe's Red, and I'm going to put a little bit of Quin Violet with it, just to shake it up a little bit. Now you'll notice that I'm just putting ever the smallest little bit of dollop of paint on the bottom of these containers, and then I will add water to them. So I actually want to show you how much paint I put in the bottom, because that's another misconception. People will put a big old slug of paint in their container, and then of course when they do their pour, the color is too deep and it's too rich, and they don't have success. So I'm going to add water, and I'm just going to wing it a little bit. But what I usually say to my students is that when you're going to do a pour, the first pour I generally do like the consistency of skim milk. The second pour I will do the consistency of 2%, and then whole milk, and then cream. So with each pour that you do, with each layer that you pour, you want to get a little bit more intense in color, a little bit less water, a little bit richer paint. And what you're doing is protecting some of these light shades along the way. And then when you take the masking off at the end, you have this beautiful glow of these thinner colors that you started with. So if I'm going to be working in my studio, I might mix up a little container like this and use it one day, and then the next day it's evaporated a little bit and I don't have to do anything to it to use it again. If it's evaporated more than I want, then of course I just add more paint to it. Now, one thing that's really confusing to people is that it takes a long time to mix up a dollop of paint. And they'll think they put it in there and they think they're ready to go, and then they pour it on their paper and they get a big glob of paint right in the middle. So when you mix them up, when you think they're mixed, mix them more. And even if you've mixed them up, when it comes time to do your actual pouring, mix them again just before you pour. So the mixing is more important than it would seem. I'm using Cheap Joe's Ugly brushes for this. They're inexpensive, and I like to have a different brush for each color that I'm pouring, because part of the beauty here is that I don't want to mix the colors I want to pour them nice and fresh and clean. So each container gets its own brush. And then in my studio, I just have my blues, my yellows, and my red brushes, and I don't ever have to pull out new ones every day or anything like that. I'm always mixing with some shades of these colors, so I just use them again and again and again. But I find that they work well, and see, it really stains the brush, so you don't want to really use your watercolor brushes to mix up your paints. So this is a nice way to do it. So from here on out, I know that this is the designated blue brush. I know that automatically. Okay, so that shows you this is about the consistency for a first pouring, and it's a little bit like skim milk. If you pour it and you don't like the effect, add a little bit more color, mix it up, and while your paper is still wet, you can pour again. You don't have to be in too much of a hurry. Everybody thinks you have to do everything so fast. That paper is very wet. You have plenty of time to mix up a different color, another color, and some colors are stronger than others. Now this red, and I put the Joe's red and this Quinn violet in here to make it such a rich red, but you can see it's a little bit thicker consistency than is this Harvest Wheat. And I probably had the same amount of paint in them. The yellows are a little harder to hold. When I pour, I tend to start with yellow and end with yellow because it's a little bit harder to get that to hold into the paper. So anyway, then when the day is over, you can put the lids on them and you can take them and use them again. If you're working in your studio, I generally leave them with the lids off and let them evaporate because you don't know when you're going to get back to them. So one thing I discovered early on was that I would save these mixtures of paint after I poured them off my board and I had all these lovely grays. Well, if you leave them with a lid on them, they actually will spoil. And you'll know that because when you take the lid off, you'll gasp. You'll know when your paint is spoiled. But so what I have found is that if they're sitting in my studio, I have this shelf around the top of my studio and I have all these little containers of paint, and they're all different shades, and I can just go and look at what shade I want, but I let them evaporate right down to the paint, and then all I have to do is add a little bit of water and they're good to use again. So I never really throw any of the paint away. In the summertime, once in a while I will indulge myself and pour outside, and if I do, then I don't necessarily save it in a container, but when I work in my studio, I save it because it all costs money, and I found an economical way to pour and not use a lot of product. So thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll try American Journey paints in the pouring. Thank you.